Napoleon's early life, from Corsica to the French army. Imagine a young boy standing at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, waves crashing against the rugged shoreline of his island home, Corsica. Born in a small town, Ajaccio, on August 15, 769, Napoleon Bonaparte began life as a child of contradictions. His world was one of stark contrasts, a blend of Corsican pride and French authority, simple island living, and the complex politics of Europe. From these humble beginnings, this boy would rise to shape the destiny of nations and leave a mark on history that echoes to this day. But how did a child from a relatively obscure family on a turbulent island grow into the Emperor of France? To understand this transformation, we must first step into the shoes of the young Napoleon, a boy who carried the weight of both his Corsican roots and the heavy expectations of French culture on his small, determined shoulders. A Corsican heart in a French world. Corsica, though annexed by France only a year before Napoleon's birth, was still a land torn between its Italian cultural roots and its new French overlords. Napoleon's family belonged to the minor nobility, yet they lived with the same simplicity as many of the island's other residents. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer with a fierce Corsican nationalist streak, while his mother, Letizia Ramolino, was the family's firm yet nurturing matriarch, teaching Napoleon the values of resilience and discipline from a young age. Though not wealthy, the Bonapartes were respected, and their name carried weight within Corsican society. Corsica itself was an island where rebellion simmered beneath the surface, where the native population felt the sting of foreign domination. For the young Napoleon, growing up in this world meant learning early on to balance a fierce Corsican identity with the reality of French control. It was a tightrope he would walk his entire life, a delicate dance between pride in his homeland and a relentless ambition to rise through the ranks of French society. In the narrow streets of Ajaccio, young Napoleon wasn't just another child. He was inquisitive, sharp-tongued, and driven. His mind was filled with dreams of glory and conquest, stories of ancient Rome, and the military exploits of heroes from centuries past. The island's winds whispered tales of great warriors, and Napoleon was determined to be one of them. He consumed history books voraciously, especially those that detailed the rise and fall of empires. In his mind, the seeds of ambition were planted, long before he would ever set foot on a battlefield. Early struggles and schooling, a boy out of place. Napoleon's family, despite their Corsican loyalty, recognized that the future lay with France. At just 9 years old, he was sent to mainland France to receive a formal education. The separation from his beloved island was the first of many emotional sacrifices Napoleon would make. Though he went willingly, it was a painful departure. In France, he was a foreigner, his Corsican accent thick and his Italian-inflected French setting him apart. At school, he was ridiculed, mocked for his strange mannerisms, and perceived as an outsider. The young boy who had been a bright, confident child in Corsica became defensive and isolated in France. Surrounded by children of France's elite, Napoleon found himself alone, misunderstood, and often humiliated. But it was in this rejection that the embers of his ambition were fanned into a fierce flame. He would not be bested by these aristocrats. He would prove them wrong. Through hard work, intelligence, and sheer determination, Napoleon would rise above them all. At Brienne, a military school where Napoleon was sent, he poured himself into his studies. He excelled at mathematics, history, and, unsurprisingly, military strategy. It was here that he began to distinguish himself, not by social grace, but by intellectual might. While other students focused on socializing, Napoleon spent hours immersed in maps and military texts, crafting imaginary battles in his mind, playing out scenarios that would later come to define his brilliance on the battlefield. Though lonely and often at odds with his classmates, Napoleon found solace in his growing knowledge. His love for history and strategy became his refuge, a place where he could dream of future glory. He was at heart a boy who believed in destiny, his own especially. His intelligence and ambition caught the attention of his teachers who, despite his lack of popularity among peers, saw in him the makings of a great leader. The French Revolution, opportunity amid chaos. By the time Napoleon graduated and entered the French military academy at École Militaire in Paris, the political climate in France had shifted dramatically. The winds of revolution were starting to blow. The old regime was crumbling under the weight of economic hardship and widespread discontent. As France teetered on the brink of collapse, Napoleon watched with keen interest. The young officer, now in his early 20s, saw the revolution as a door, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to break free from the rigid structures of French aristocracy. He was not content to simply serve. Napoleon knew that in the chaos of revolution there was a chance for someone like him, someone who wasn't born into privilege, someone who had clawed his way up through intellect and hard work to rise to heights unimaginable in the old world. But this ambition was not just a thirst for personal power. For Napoleon, the revolution represented a profound shift in what was possible. It was the moment when men of merit could replace men of privilege. He saw himself as the embodiment of the new France, a self-made man who would carve out his place not through birthright, but through sheer force of will. In 1785, the year Napoleon graduated, France was teetering on the edge of the French Revolution. By 1789, when the storming of the Bastille marked the beginning of this seismic political shift, Napoleon was already planning how he would use his military expertise to position himself in the new order. He wasn't just a participant in history, he was ready to shape it. The Siege of Toulon, Napoleon's first step toward greatness. Napoleon's first major opportunity to prove himself came during the Siege of Toulon in 1793. France was now fully engulfed in revolution, and Toulon, a key city, had rebelled against the new republic, welcoming British forces. For the revolutionaries, retaking Toulon was critical, and Napoleon, though still a relatively unknown officer, was tasked with overseeing the artillery. This was his moment, a chance to shine. With a mix of audacity and innovative military tactics, Napoleon organized the artillery in such a way that he broke through the British defenses, turning the tide of the battle. The success of the siege wasn't just a military victory, it was a personal triumph. Napoleon was suddenly a hero, recognized by the Republic for his strategic genius. It was the first of many moments where his name would echo across France. This success earned him a promotion to brigadier general at just 24 years old. For a boy once mocked for his foreignness and ridiculed for his accent, the recognition felt like vindication. But Napoleon wasn't content with just one victory. The fire inside him burned brighter with each success. He was driven by the belief that he was destined for greatness, a belief that would carry him far, but also, one day, contribute to his downfall. The seeds of ambition. Napoleon's early years were marked by struggle, rejection, and a burning desire to prove himself. From the small streets of Ajaccio to the prestigious halls of French military academies, he had fought to earn his place in a world that saw him as an outsider. But through his intelligence, determination, and tactical brilliance, Napoleon turned every challenge into an opportunity. He was more than a product of his circumstances. He was a visionary who saw the possibilities in every crisis. A man driven by a belief in his own destiny. As Napoleon's story continues, it becomes clear that his early life laid the foundation for the extraordinary leader he would become. The boy from Corsica, who once stood alone at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, was now on a path that would lead him to the highest echelons of power. But with each step toward glory, the weight of ambition would grow heavier. A weight that, one day, might prove too much for even Napoleon to bear. Napoleon's rise to power. A revolutionary leader. By the time Napoleon emerged from his early military schooling and into the stormy world of post-revolutionary France, the country was on the verge of collapse. The French Revolution, which began with promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity, had instead spiraled into chaos and bloodshed. Kings and aristocrats fell, guillotines worked overtime in public squares, and France itself seemed destined to fracture under the weight of its own ideals. Amid this whirlwind of political upheaval, one man saw not ruin, but opportunity. For Napoleon Bonaparte, the chaos of revolution was fertile ground for something far greater than the ideals of the revolution itself. It was a stage upon which his personal ambition could soar. Here was a man, a young officer in his 20s, who saw the revolution not as a period of destruction, but as a moment of transformation. His own transformation, and that of a country desperate for order. The revolutionary battleground. A leader is forged. Napoleon's early military career during the Revolution was marked by his keen ability to navigate both the shifting sands of the battlefield and the treacherous terrain of political intrigue. For Napoleon, the Revolution was not just a time of idealistic fervor, but a time when raw ambition could push a person to heights that were unimaginable under the rigid hierarchies of the old monarchy. After his success at the Siege of Toulon in 1793, Napoleon became a man on the rise. His victory not only earned him the title of brigadier general, but it also brought him to the attention of those in power, men who saw in Napoleon the brilliance and ambition that could stabilize the Republic. However, in revolutionary France, favor was fickle. The Republic, born out of the ashes of monarchy, was itself in constant flux. Governments rose and fell as easily as heads in the Place de la Révolution, and allegiances shifted overnight. But Napoleon's sharp intellect allowed him to navigate these political waters with ease. He was both opportunist and idealist, willing to swear loyalty to revolutionary ideals while also cultivating alliances with key figures in the government. Napoleon understood, perhaps more than most, that the revolution needed not just a soldier, but a strategist, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. Italy and Egypt, the first glimpses of greatness. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the French army of Italy, and it was here that he first truly revealed his genius. The Italian campaign was a turning point in his career. Not only because of the victories he would achieve, but because of how he won those victories. Napoleon faced a ragged, demoralized army, outnumbered and outgunned by their enemies, the Austrians and the Piedmontese. Yet, He saw potential where others saw defeat. Napoleon reorganized his army, instilled discipline, and most importantly, inspired his soldiers. In letters to his wife Josephine, whom he had recently married, Napoleon's confidence was palpable. He saw the Italian campaign as his proving ground, not just for his military strategies, but for his leadership. He was no longer just a commander. He was a leader of men, someone his soldiers were willing to follow into the jaws of death. Through a series of brilliant tactical maneuvers, Napoleon led his army to victory after victory, and by the end of the campaign, northern Italy was firmly under French control. Napoleon's star was rising, and the young general became a national hero. His soldiers adored him, not just because of his military acumen, but because he made them feel invincible. He led from the front, sharing in their hardships, often sleeping on the cold ground beside them. He spoke of glory and honor, and the men believed him. In Napoleon, they saw someone who wasn't just fighting for France, but for the revolution's promise of a better future. But even as he basked in the glow of his triumphs in Italy, Napoleon's mind was already turning to new horizons. The young general had an insatiable appetite for conquest and recognition. His ambition knew no bounds, and soon he set his sights on the East. In 1798, he led an expedition to Egypt, not just as a military venture, but as a bid to disrupt British trade routes and potentially pave the way for French influence in the region. Egypt was a campaign that showcased both the brilliance and the hubris of Napoleon. At the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon achieved a decisive victory against the Mamluks, using modern military techniques against an army bound by tradition. Yet, even as he triumphed on land, disaster struck at sea. The British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, destroyed the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile, effectively stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt. Despite this catastrophic loss, Napoleon's propaganda machine worked overtime to spin the campaign as a victory. His ability to control his image, both in France and abroad, became one of his most potent weapons. To the French public, Napoleon was a hero, a conqueror who had achieved glory in the sands of Egypt. But behind the scenes, he knew the truth. The Egyptian campaign had been a failure in strategic terms, but Napoleon's genius lay in his ability to turn even defeat into a stepping stone for future power. The coup of 18 Brumaire, power through strategy. By 1799, France was once again in turmoil. The government, known as the Directory, was floundering under the weight of internal strife and external threats. The revolution's promises of liberty and equality seemed distant, and the French people were hungry for stability. Sensing that the time was right, Napoleon made his move. The coup of 18th of Brumaire, November 9, 1799, by the revolutionary calendar, was a masterclass in political maneuvering. With the support of key figures in the military and the political elite, Napoleon staged a coup d'état that dismantled the ineffective Directory and replaced it with the Consulate, a new government in which he quickly positioned himself as the leading figure. The coup was as much about perception as it was about strategy. To the people, Napoleon was the savior of the revolution, a man who had fought on the front lines and understood their struggles. He promised not to dismantle the gains of the revolution, but to protect them. And yet, behind the scenes, Napoleon was consolidating power in ways that would soon make him the most powerful man in France. As first consul, Napoleon held the reins of the French government, but his ambitions did not end there. He saw the consulate as a stepping stone toward greater power, power that would allow him to reshape France and, eventually, Europe in his own image. The revolution that had promised equality for all was, in Napoleon's hands, transformed into something different. A meritocracy where talent, not birthright, determined one's fate, but also where a single man held ultimate authority. Napoleon was no monarch, yet he ruled with the certainty of one. The genius of Napoleon, military and political brilliance. To understand why Napoleon succeeded where so many before him had failed, one must look at the unique combination of talents that he possessed. On the battlefield, Napoleon was without peer. His ability to read a situation, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to make bold, decisive moves won him battle after battle. He turned the art of war into a science, using speed, surprise, and innovation to outmaneuver his enemies. His use of artillery in particular revolutionized warfare. Where others saw limitations, Napoleon saw possibilities. But Napoleon's genius was not confined to the battlefield. He was equally brilliant in the realm of politics. He understood that military victories alone would not secure his place in history. He needed to shape the narrative of those victories. He carefully crafted his image as a man of the people, a leader who embodied the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. His propaganda machine was relentless, churning out stories of his greatness, his vision, and his ability to bring stability to a fractured nation. Napoleon also had a remarkable ability to inspire loyalty. His soldiers followed him with near religious devotion, and the French public viewed him as a hero. Even his political rivals, who feared his rise, could not deny his brilliance. Napoleon had a rare talent for bending people to his will, not through fear or coercion, but through a combination of charisma, competence, and sheer force of personality. Reform and rule. Shaping the nation. With the power of the consulate firmly in his grasp, Napoleon set about reshaping France. His reforms touched nearly every aspect of French life. He modernized the country's financial system, introduced a new legal code, which would later be known as the Napoleonic Code, restructured the educational system, and created institutions that would outlast his rule. Napoleon was as much a reformer as he was a conqueror, and in many ways, his domestic achievements were just as significant as his military ones. The Napoleonic Code, in particular, was a groundbreaking legal document that would go on to influence legal systems around the world. It enshrined principles of equality before the law, the right to property, and the abolition of feudal privileges. For Napoleon, these reforms were not just about governing France. They were about leaving a legacy, about ensuring that his name would be remembered not just for his battles, but for the institutions he built. Yet, even as he reformed France, Napoleon's eyes were always on the horizon. He was not content with ruling France alone. He wanted to reshape all of Europe. And to do that, he knew he needed more than just political power. He needed to become something more. He needed to become an emperor. The rise of a revolutionary emperor. By the dawn of the 19th century, Napoleon had risen from an obscure Corsican to the most powerful man in France. He had navigated the perilous waters of revolution, outwitted political rivals, and inspired a nation desperate for stability. Yet, as his power grew, so too did his ambition. He was no longer just a general or a consul. He was a man who believed he was destined for something far greater. The stage was set for the next chapter in Napoleon's life, a chapter in which he would rise even higher, not just as the leader of France, but as an emperor who sought to reshape the world in his image. But with such heights came immense risks, and the same brilliance that had propelled him to the top would also set the stage for his eventual fall. The emperor's reign, triumph, and controversy. By 1804, the world knew Napoleon Bonaparte not just as a brilliant general or the first consul of France, but as a man destined to shape the future of Europe. Yet, his ambition extended far beyond the borders of France. It wasn't enough for Napoleon to be remembered as a revolutionary leader or a military genius. He wanted to be crowned emperor, a title that symbolized absolute power, control, and permanence. The story of Napoleon's reign as Emperor of the French is one of immense triumph, sweeping reforms, and controversy that would ultimately shape his legacy as both a hero and a tyrant. But how does a man who rose on the back of revolutionary ideals of equality and freedom transform himself into an emperor? This question would follow Napoleon for the rest of his life and define his reign. The coronation, a bold statement of power. On December 2, 1804, in the grand setting of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte took his destiny into his own hands. In a break from tradition, he did not allow Pope Pius VII to place the crown on his head. Instead, Napoleon crowned himself. This gesture was symbolic. Napoleon was not beholden to any higher power, be it the church, royalty, or fate itself. His authority came from within, a product of his will, his victories, and his vision for the future. This act was also a message to the world. Napoleon was not merely a ruler sanctioned by divine right, as monarchs had been for centuries. He was the product of his own ambition and merit. The revolution had dismantled the monarchy, and now here stood a new kind of emperor, one forged in the fires of revolution and war. Yet, for all the symbolism, Napoleon's self-coronation also signaled a critical shift. He was now more than a revolutionary leader. He was the embodiment of the state, and his vision would determine the fate of Europe. In that moment, Napoleon believed he had achieved what few could. He had rewritten the rules of power. But this self-coronation also raised uncomfortable questions. How could the man who had sworn to uphold the values of the French Revolution now place a crown upon his own head? Was he betraying the very ideals of equality and liberty that had launched him into prominence, or was he, in fact, their ultimate protector? To the people of France, worn out by years of instability, Napoleon's promise of order and greatness was far more appealing than abstract revolutionary principles. And so, with the cheers of a grateful nation, Napoleon's empire began. The Grande Armée, Napoleon's invincible force. Napoleon's reign was built on the twin pillars of military might and reform. On the battlefield, he was unmatched. His Grande Armée, as it was called, became the most feared and disciplined force in Europe. Comprised of soldiers from all corners of the empire, this army was not merely a military machine, it was a representation of Napoleon's vision for a united and modern Europe. Napoleon understood the power of symbolism, and the Grande Armée embodied the ideals of meritocracy. Soldiers were promoted based on skill and bravery, not birthright. Napoleon himself had risen from modest beginnings, and now he offered the same opportunity to any man who proved his worth in battle. For many of the young men who served under him, Napoleon wasn't just a leader. He was a figure of hope, a man who had rewritten his destiny and offered them the chance to do the same. But the Grande Armée was more than just a fighting force. It was Napoleon's instrument of empire. Through its victories, he spread the values of the revolution: equality before the law, meritocracy, and secular governance across Europe. At the same time, his military conquests were also acts of personal ambition. Napoleon was reshaping the continent in his image, creating new states and installing loyal rulers, often from within his own family. One of the most stunning displays of Napoleon's military genius came at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. Known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, Napoleon faced the combined forces of Russia and Austria. Outnumbered and in a seemingly disadvantageous position, Napoleon turned the tide with a brilliantly orchestrated tactical maneuver that led to a decisive victory. Austerlitz was not just a battle, it was a statement. Napoleon was, without question, the greatest military mind of his time. The victory at Austerlitz solidified Napoleon's dominance over Europe, and in the aftermath, he reorganized the continent according to his will. He created the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states under French influence, and dismantled the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had existed for nearly 1,000 years. Napoleon was not just winning battles, he was reshaping the map of Europe, turning age-old monarchies into extensions of his empire. Reforms and the Napoleonic Code, shaping society. While Napoleon's military victories brought him power, it was his reforms that cemented his legacy. He believed in more than just conquering territories. He wanted to reshape societies according to the principles of rationality, efficiency, and order. Central to this vision was the Napoleonic Code, which he introduced in 1804. The Napoleonic Code was a comprehensive set of laws that would influence not only France but many other countries around the world. It enshrined several key principles of the revolution, such as equality before the law, the abolition of feudal privileges, and the protection of property rights. For Napoleon, the code was a way to ensure that the revolutionary ideals he had once fought for were maintained, even as he consolidated power. However, the Napoleonic Code was not without its controversies. While it guaranteed civil liberties, it also reinforced the traditional roles of men and women. Under the code, women's rights were significantly restricted. Wives were placed under the authority of their husbands, and their ability to manage property was curtailed. For all of Napoleon's progressive ideas, his approach to gender roles was decidedly conservative, a reflection of his belief in a patriarchal society. Beyond the code, Napoleon's reforms extended to the realm of education, administration, and infrastructure. He created a centralized education system designed to cultivate a new generation of bureaucrats and military officers. His lycée system became the foundation for French public education, designed to train the future leaders of the empire. Napoleon was building not just for the present but for the future. He envisioned an empire that would last, with a society that functioned according to rational laws and structures. In many ways, Napoleon's reforms laid the groundwork for modern Europe. His belief in meritocracy, secularism, and efficient governance spread far beyond France's borders. Countries like Spain, Italy, and the German states adopted elements of the Napoleonic Code, and even after his downfall, the legacy of these reforms endured. Love and betrayal, Napoleon and Josephine. While Napoleon's public life was defined by conquest and reform, his private life was equally dramatic. Central to his personal story was his relationship with Josephine de Beauharnais, the woman he married in 1796. Napoleon's love for Josephine was intense and all-consuming. In letters to her, he poured out his heart, expressing his longing and devotion, even while leading armies across Europe. Yet, their relationship was tumultuous. Josephine, a widow with 2 children from her first marriage, had affairs during Napoleon's long absences, and despite his deep love for her, Napoleon's jealousy and suspicions grew. Their marriage, though passionate, was fraught with tension. In 1810, after years of trying and failing to produce an heir, Napoleon made the painful decision to divorce Josephine. It wasn't just a personal loss. Napoleon needed a son, an heir to secure the future of his empire. His divorce from Josephine was a pragmatic decision, but it also broke his heart. He married Marie-Louise of Austria soon after, and she gave him the son he so desperately desired. But Napoleon would always remember Josephine as his first and truest love. His final words on his deathbed, France, the army, Josephine, revealed that even in his last moments, she held a special place in his heart. The continental system, overreach and resistance. As Napoleon expanded his empire, he sought to weaken his greatest rival, Great Britain. Unable to defeat the British at sea after the catastrophic loss at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Napoleon turned to economic warfare. In 1806, he implemented the continental system, a blockade designed to cut off Britain's trade with Europe. Napoleon believed that by choking Britain's economy, he could bring the island nation to its knees. However, the continental system was an enormous gamble, and it quickly became one of Napoleon's most significant missteps. The blockade hurt European economies more than it did Britain's. Countries that relied on British goods faced shortages and rising prices, leading to widespread discontent. Worse still, enforcing the blockade required Napoleon to extend his influence over reluctant nations, which only bred resentment. Smuggling flourished, and even Napoleon's allies began to resist his economic stranglehold. The continental system, which was meant to be a strategic masterstroke, ultimately weakened Napoleon's grip on Europe. The invasion of Spain, a fatal miscalculation. Napoleon's decision to place his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne of Spain in 1808 was another turning point in his reign. The Spanish people, deeply Catholic and fiercely independent, resisted French rule from the outset. What Napoleon thought would be a simple occupation turned into a brutal, drawn-out guerrilla war known as the Peninsular War. The Spanish conflict drained French resources and morale. It became a symbol of Napoleon's overreach, his attempt to impose his vision on a country that refused to be subdued. The war also revealed the limits of Napoleon's power. Despite his brilliance on the battlefield, he could not control the will of the people. The Peninsular War became a slow, grinding disaster that weakened France and emboldened its enemies. The highs of an empire and the warning signs of decline. As emperor, Napoleon achieved heights of power and influence that few before him could have imagined. His military victories, coupled with his sweeping reforms, left an indelible mark on Europe. He restructured entire nations, spread revolutionary ideals, and crafted an empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. Yet, for all his triumphs, the seeds of his downfall were already sown. Napoleon's ambition, which had driven him to the pinnacle of power, was also his greatest weakness. His relentless pursuit of dominance, his refusal to accept limits, and his belief that he could reshape the world according to his will, all set the stage for his eventual collapse. The Peninsular War, the failures of the continental system, and his personal struggles hinted at the challenges that lay ahead. But Napoleon was not done yet. The greatest test of his leadership, and the beginning of his dramatic fall, was still to come, as he turned his sights eastward toward Russia, where the cold, unforgiving winter would bring his empire to its knees. Fall from grace. The tragic decline of Napoleon. By the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte had crafted a European empire that stretched farther than many could have imagined. He had crowned himself emperor, forged new states, installed his family members on thrones, and through his genius in both war and governance, appeared unstoppable. But as with many great figures throughout history, the seeds of Napoleon's downfall were planted at the height of his power. His ambition, which had driven him to conquer and reform Europe, now became the very force that would lead to his undoing. The story of Napoleon's fall from grace is one of hubris, overreach, and an inevitable clash with fate. As he pushed farther and farther, both in his imperial ambitions and on the battlefield, cracks began to appear in the seemingly invincible empire he had built. His greatest mistake, the invasion of Russia, would mark the beginning of his dramatic decline, leading to a series of defeats that would culminate in one of the most famous battles in history, Waterloo. The Russian campaign, a fatal mistake. The turning point in Napoleon's reign, and indeed in his life, came in 1812, when he embarked on what would become one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history, the invasion of Russia. By this point, Napoleon had already extended his influence over much of Europe, with his empire dominating from Spain in the west to the outskirts of Russia in the east. Yet Russia under Tsar Alexander I remained a thorn in his side. Although Russia had been forced to comply with Napoleon's continental system, which was designed to economically cripple Britain by preventing trade with Europe, the Russian economy suffered heavily under these restrictions. In defiance of Napoleon, Tsar Alexander had begun to relax enforcement of the blockade, effectively signaling that Russia was no longer fully in step with Napoleon's imperial ambitions. Napoleon, ever the strategist and unwilling to tolerate dissent, saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. Determined to bring Russia back in line and secure his dominance in Europe once and for all, he assembled the largest army the world had ever seen, over 600,000 men from across his empire, the Grande Armée. He was confident that the campaign would be swift, a few decisive battles that would force the Tsar to surrender. But Napoleon severely underestimated the scale and complexity of what he was about to face. In June of 1812, the Grande Armée began its march into Russia. The initial stages of the invasion went according to plan, but soon the Russian strategy of retreating and burning their own land, the scorched earth tactic, began to take its toll on Napoleon's forces. As the French advanced deeper into Russian territory, they found nothing but empty, desolate land, with no food or shelter to sustain them. The Russian army, avoiding a direct confrontation, lured Napoleon further into the vast expanse of Russia, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point. The decisive battle that Napoleon had hoped for finally came in September, near Moscow, at the Battle of Borodino. It was one of the bloodiest single-day engagements in the Napoleonic Wars, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Though the French emerged victorious, it was a Pyrrhic victory. The losses were staggering, and it did little to break Russian resolve. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found the city abandoned and in flames. Rather than surrender, the Russians had burned their own capital. It was a psychological blow to Napoleon, who realized too late that the Tsar would never capitulate. With no shelter and winter fast approaching, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. The retreat from Moscow was catastrophic. As the temperatures plummeted and the bitter Russian winter set in, the Grande Armée, already weakened by months of fighting and shortages, began to collapse. Starvation, exposure, and constant harassment by Russian forces decimated Napoleon's once great army. By the time the remnants of his forces staggered back across the border, fewer than 30,000 soldiers remained from the original 600,000. The Russian campaign was a disaster that shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. For the first time, he had been defeated not just by the strength of an enemy army, but by the sheer magnitude of nature and his own overconfidence. The Sixth Coalition. Europe rises against Napoleon. The failure of the Russian campaign emboldened Napoleon's enemies across Europe. Sensing that the time had come to strike, a coalition of European powers, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, came together to challenge Napoleon's dominance. This was the Sixth Coalition, and they were determined to bring down the empire that had wreaked havoc across the continent for more than a decade. Napoleon, though weakened by the loss of his army in Russia, was not yet ready to relinquish his power. In 1813, he quickly raised new forces and engaged the coalition in a series of battles across Germany. Despite his best efforts and some initial successes, Napoleon's forces were ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemies aligned against him. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations, in October 1813, was the largest and most decisive defeat Napoleon had ever faced. It was a crushing blow, as he lost more than 90,000 men, and it marked the beginning of the end for his empire. With his forces in disarray and coalition armies advancing on Paris, Napoleon's once loyal allies began to abandon him. The European powers who had long feared his ambition now sensed an opportunity to finally rid themselves of the man who had reshaped Europe to his will. In April 1814, under immense pressure from both his enemies and his own generals, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. The empire he had built so meticulously was now crumbling around him. The exile to Elba, a fallen emperor, reflects. After his abdication, Napoleon was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. Unlike most exiles, Napoleon retained the title of emperor and was allowed to rule Elba as a sovereign entity. But the contrast between his former glory and his new domain could not have been more stark. Elba was a tiny island compared to the vast empire Napoleon had once controlled, and though he set about improving the infrastructure and governance of the island, it was clear to all, including Napoleon himself, that his rule on Elba was a shadow of what it once was. But even in exile, Napoleon's mind was as sharp as ever. He watched closely as Europe tried to rebuild itself in the wake of his downfall. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored in France, but it quickly became clear that King Louis XIII was struggling to stabilize the country. The revolutionary ideals that had once fueled Napoleon's rise still simmered beneath the surface of French society. And many veterans of Napoleon's armies remained loyal to their former emperor. Napoleon bided his time. Elba was not his final chapter. He refused to believe that his story was over. In March 1815, less than a year after his exile, Napoleon made a daring escape from Elba. With just a few hundred loyal soldiers, he sailed back to France, landing on the southern coast near Cannes. In a dramatic turn of events, as he marched toward Paris, soldiers sent to capture him instead joined his cause. The French people, weary of the Bourbon monarchy, rallied to Napoleon's side. Within weeks, Napoleon had retaken Paris without firing a shot. The 100 Days, as this brief period of his return to power came to be known, had begun. The Battle of Waterloo, the final defeat. Napoleon's return to power shocked the European powers, who had thought they were rid of him for good. In a matter of weeks, a new coalition was formed, this time with the singular goal of destroying Napoleon once and for all. The coalition forces, led by the Duke of Wellington from Britain and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher from Prussia, quickly mobilized to stop Napoleon's resurgence. Napoleon, ever the strategist, knew that his best chance lay in defeating the coalition forces before they could fully unite. In June 1815, he launched a swift campaign into Belgium, hoping to divide and conquer the British and Prussian armies. This would lead to one of the most famous battles in history, Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced off against Wellington's British forces at the small Belgian village of Waterloo. It was a battle fought under the dark, stormy skies of a summer day. Napoleon's strategy, as always, was bold, but fate, which had so often favored him, now turned against him. The battlefield was a muddy quagmire from days of rain slowing down his troops and artillery. Despite early successes, the arrival of Blücher's Prussian forces tipped the scales against Napoleon. In a few hours, what had begun as a tactical struggle turned into a rout. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo was not just a military loss, it was the end of an era. His reign, which had begun with such promise and ambition, was now over. His forces shattered, Napoleon was once again forced to abdicate. Exiled to St. Helena, the emperor in isolation. This time, the victorious European powers ensured that Napoleon would never return. Instead of sending him to a nearby island, they chose a remote, windswept island in the South Atlantic, St. Helena. Isolated and far from any major landmass, Napoleon would spend the remaining years of his life in exile, with only a handful of loyal companions and British guards for company. On St. Helena, Napoleon's health deteriorated rapidly. He lived in relative comfort, but his mind was still as active as ever. He spent his days dictating his memoirs, reflecting on his life, his battles, and his downfall. In his writings, Napoleon alternated between defiance and reflection, at times blaming his downfall on treachery or fate, and at others, acknowledging that his own ambition had led to his demise. St. Helena was a far cry from the courts of Paris or the battlefields of Europe. Napoleon, the man who had once shaped the destiny of a continent, was now reduced to a prisoner on a barren island. Yet even in isolation, his legend grew. Visitors and guards who interacted with him were often struck by his charisma and intelligence, and stories of the great Napoleon continued to circulate across Europe. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died on St. Helena, likely from stomach cancer, though rumors of poisoning persisted for years. His final words, reportedly, were France, Army, Josephine, a tribute to the country he had ruled, the soldiers who had followed him, and the woman he had loved. The legacy of Napoleon, a life of triumph and tragedy. Napoleon Bonaparte's life was one of extraordinary highs and devastating lows. He rose from obscurity on a small island in the Mediterranean to become the most powerful man in Europe, reshaping entire nations and leaving a legacy that still resonates today. He was a man of immense talent, brilliance, and ambition, yet his insatiable desire for power ultimately led to his downfall. His reforms, particularly the Napoleonic Code, left a lasting mark on the legal systems of many countries. His emphasis on meritocracy and education reshaped French society and influenced governance far beyond his time. Militarily, his strategies are still studied in military academies around the world. Yet, his wars caused untold suffering, and his ambition led to the deaths of millions. In the end, Napoleon's story is not just one of victory and defeat, but of the human spirit's drive to shape the world. He embodied both the greatness and the flaws of ambition, reminding us that the quest for power, though alluring, comes with profound consequences. A legacy etched in history. Napoleon's fall was as dramatic as his rise, but his legacy endures. Even today, his name evokes both admiration and controversy. He was a man who believed that destiny had chosen him to reshape the world, and for a time he succeeded. But like all who reach for too much, he found that power once gained is never truly secure. His life is a lesson in the costs of ambition, the heights it can take you to, and the depths to which it can drag you down. As the sun set on his empire, it also set on an era. But the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte continues to loom large over the pages of history.